And the same they charge with different potential meaning and hold different cultural value. Yeah, that's basically what it means. So Mitchell explains that many things go by the name image, including pictures, statues, optical illusions, maps, diagrams, dreams, hallucinations, spectacles, projections, poems, patterns, memories, and even ideas. Images are culturally conceptualized in ways that extend their limit to abstract forms, such as a map or memory. Yeah? So that's like early encounters with semiotics. Yeah? You suddenly find out that a video is also a text, that a person is a text. Yeah? There is like there is like a parole in language, yeah, of text that you usually apply it to written works. However, when you change a system of reference, the same language applies in different contexts to different phenomena, yeah? Basic semiotics. Mitchell aligns terms such as likeness, resemblance, and similitude to the term image, words that align with ideas around representations. To represent something or someone is to stand in for a thing or person. Representations are active agents that participate in our negotiated relationship with the past, which is particularly interesting in terms of themes to this, but we don't really have time to elaborate on this in the detail I would like to, because we have absolutely loads of notes from the reading. So a concept of heritage is a complex socio-cultural process where visual culture is used to represent the past in the present every day, and the power of representation lies with few, yet the subjective response is owned by many. The Sydney Opera, released from architectural immobility, can be a form of visual currency that facilitates social interaction between people, or it does not. The arbitrary nature of ordering systems is revealing of our cultural norms. A taxonomy that might not make sense to one person is perfectly logical to a person from within the appropriate intellectual culture. The apparently arbitrary systems are not incorrect, but rather mirror the limitations of our own systems of thoughts, as we all always and primarily see things through our own perspective. Baudrillard theorizes the precession of simulacra, the way copies or representations come to stand in for the original thing. So maybe you remember last time when I did the part of presentation where I focused on the matrix. I also mentioned simulation and simulacra, which I believe the matrix is the expression of. So it's all connected. Baudrillard's theory centers on the distinction between the copy and the real for a society where the copy is increasingly treated as the real thing. So I actually did mention that last time, yeah, that the precession of simulacra, yeah, this is the territory. We live in a construct, yeah? We live in a socially constructed realities. We're so far removed from the real that really is no longer possible. Everything we do, like whole language, yeah? It's a cultural construction subjected to multiple discourses of power, yeah? And then there are, because you have actual language, and then you have parole, how you use it, yeah? And that's what contributes to shapes of multiple discourses, yeah? How the language is actually used is not necessarily what you say, but how you say, in what context. It's all constructed, yeah. We're removed from the real, we live on the map. So while Baudrillard argues that the consequence of this is the loss of reality and the establishment of endless simulacra, the case of the Sydney Opera House as a copy, a lesser version of the original, potentially, has value specifically for the way it simulates or represents the building. Baudrillard faces the dissolution of the separation between the original and the copy. He explains that it culminates in pure simulacrum. He devised a system of orders that describes the successive phases of the image. While Baudrillard's precession of simulacra reveals the extent of influence that the Sydney Opera House it's focused on the relationship between the original and the copy, does not account for the value of these artifacts for people. So basically these phases of the image, first you have like simple, representation, like that is a pure reflection of a profound reality. This would be like, for example, photographs of the building from the first order of representation, exactly. As they reflect a profound reality, since to produce them proximity to the building is required. So it's like a plain image of like Sydney Opera House, It's just like a reflection of a profound reality. There is an object and it's like unaltered. It's just that object. Maybe it has meaning, but the primary meaning is that of being the object. So later it masks, when it's like further culturally processed basically, it masks and denaturates a profound reality. So you have like hats, cupcakes, Lego sets and logos that they depict Sydney Opera House, but they are not accurate representations of the Sydney Opera House. They distort the building, but remain recognizable. Models, drawings, and historic photographs of the building construction can also be framed as a second order of representation. However, these masks the absence of profound reality, as they are objects of times past. So although, let's say that it was like a historic photograph of the building construction, you could say that it is, denaturated, whatever, profound reality, because it's not exactly, the object from like the first order of representation. However, the actual object has been further processed into, its own, into itself, and what was the subject of, the first order representation is already gone. It's absent as a profound reality. The profound reality of this object has changed. So they are objects of times past. So later, at some cases, it masks the absence of profound reality exactly. So objects that have no relation to any reality whatsoever. It could be the size of a yacht or a photograph of dishes drying in a rack. So it would be like more abstract representation. It could be also, like an impressionist representation as well. So these things are not the Sydney Opera House, but have become associated with this place over time, mostly because of the cultural value. It was negotiated. It didn't become on its own. It was like socially and culturally negotiated over time. It didn't happen they built Opera House, and suddenly next day people were making memes about it, or selling cool looking things that represent Sydney Opera House. It was culturally negotiated because of the processes of negotiation of cultural value, as well as specific discourses that Sydney Opera House is involved with. And finally, it has no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is all pure simulacrum. So they basically are simulacra of the Sydney Opera House, replicas of the building that have become entities that attract their own tourists. And the example given was scale versions of the building in theme parks. Alongside the physical examples are the digital artifacts, photos or videos depicting the Sydney Opera House or its composite shots in alternate locations and states of decay. So, you could say that films, they operate with simulacra to create hyper-reality. That's basically potentially a pure simulacrum. The composite shots that alternate, both the meaning potentially, and in ways the location, or states of the given object. So that's basically a bit of simulacra stuff. a bit complex, but I was made it a couple of times and we can mount it. User participation, you can shift the normative power structure endemic within architectural production as well as in the consequent valuation of architecture. This can be understood as a reaction to the power and cultural capital held by the elite architects that are commissioned to produce high-profile public buildings, since public participation in the design process sidesteps the idea of the architectural genius, often connected with landmark buildings. Many architectural theory focuses on understanding buildings in terms of nationalistic styles and traditions within a hierarchy of entirely aesthetic objects. Sociological framework of social capital, the field and the habitus help to analyze the production of architecture, where significant civil projects are exclusive terrain of elite architects. That most people like that. This select group of architects legitimize their masculinized position of power through the notion of the design genius. Such discourses maintain control over what is defined as architecture, which examples are to be valued, the values of which they are recognized, and therefore who should be celebrated. So this basically is very similar to, you know, the class-related unequal distribution of capital, and in this case of power, yeah, because it's like with film genres, yeah, like taxonomies are arbitrary. To define the taxonomy, you need to choose the set of, like, let's say, texts that you decided are similar in some ways, and it's basically the same thing. A group of like privileged people who establish their social capital through different channels. They defined the idea of architectural genius. So therefore they dictate what is defined as architecture and which examples are to be loaded, for the values which they are recognized for. Yeah. So all taxonomies are arbitrary. Yeah? They are social constructs themselves, and they are negotiated and they shift over time. Yeah? And there are also multiple points of reference to look at, basically multiple deterministic screens through which you can look at any taxonomy and derive completely new understanding from what you're seeing there. Yeah? Doesn't mean that certain views are wrong. It only means they operate with different system of reference, which then causes a lot of problems because there is a discourse. Yeah? People push for the dominant discourse. Yeah? So a lot of cultural debates, yeah? Or even wars, wars. Some buildings exemplify cultural capital, and therefore the social and cultural conditions pertinent to their production are more clearly indicated in the process that architects must negotiate. The discipline of architecture tends to focus on a specific group of buildings that enter the architectural canon via teaching, architectural press, media, and politics. So that's basically what I just said. Yeah. So the canon is a recognized set of basically texts that the audiences have already negotiated cultural value for. Yeah, and the thing with audiences is it's like an interpretive community. You have this very broad theoretical frame or system of reference through which you understand certain, let's say, semiotic structure, but you recognize it because it's not a structure for decoding the meaning, negotiating the meaning from the text, but in fact it is a structure for the production of the text into which you are socialized throughout your whole life, because you're a social agent, moving around with a certain field, which would be for example a field of cultural production. Like when you, for example, watch genre films, you, well, at some point you recognize it like automatically, yeah? You know, like the good guys always win, yeah? Like in action films, like, you know, the tough guys never look at explosions, things like that, yeah? These are these are not really, well, they are used as frames of understanding genre, but they don't derive from negotiating the meaning, like from the consumer's perspective, but in fact they derive from like industrial templates for the production of, in this case, like a genre film, yeah? And we're only like socializing it. It's also like a social construction. There is no pure meaning in a sign. Yeah? There needs to be an audience for it that operates with, you know, a system of reference for a sign to have a meaning. Signs don't have meaning on its own, on their own. So participatory culture aims to address the way established notions of audience framed some social groups as passive spectators. Jenkins was concerned that framing audiences in this way is neatly defined readings of popular culture. He knew that groups of people participate in popular culture by drawing on mass media in everyday social life. This allowed him and other researchers to make more nuanced accounts of audience perception. So that's a bit of like reception history now, yeah? So initially audience research was premised on a straightforward model of producer text audience. So they were basically like, you know, it was like a text activated meaning, and, you know, audiences were considered passive, and, you know, Stuart Hall, he devised like encoding decoding model, yeah, and it was understood that, let's say there is a genre film produced, so, you know, the studio and, you know, executive producers and the director, yeah, they encode text with a certain meaning, yeah, that they express certain things, and then audience watches it, consumes text, you know, meaning that, you know, an audience engages with it meaningfully and reads that given meaning from the text as a passive, well, you know, not a diverse audience, yeah, which is not the truth. Yeah, this was like early reception studies. It was like a certain assumption in regard to the audience that seemed to have made sense when looked at through the prism of like the state of cultural studies nowadays, which was also like early days for certain disciplines. So the second, after that happened, yeah, second generation of researchers made a departure from whole semiotic framing and made use of ethnographic approaches to research audience reception. Rather than simply trying to understand the content of the message, whether it was decoded or not, for example, Arndt's research sought to investigate the basis of audience members' emotional attachment to this to any like television program. Yeah? And the third generation is characterized by a departure from a model of producer text audience, as scholars began to question the framing of audiences as neatly bounded entities. And those researchers understood the significance of different kinds of media within the context of people's everyday lives, and they acknowledged that audiences are complex, mobile, and dynamic entities. And my favorite description of audiences, yeah, is that any audience, like a general audience, yeah, consists of highly diverse and potentially conflicting audiences. Yeah, it's like one concentrated community of people united in the process of consumption of the text, but this is potentially where the similarity ends, because as it is outlined here, it's the context of people's everyday lives. So you could say, you know, you can quite clearly link it with like people's habitus and their quantities of accumulated forms of capital. Potentially, every single member of an audience will decode any text in a different way. There are different like pragmatics You have like semantic, syntactic, pragmatic, model of like discursive negotiation of meaning, devised by Altman in 1999, which is actually a more accurate approach to well, both audiences and the reception of meta text. There isn't one meaning, like I said, there isn't one only right pure meaning of a text. There may be like a suggestion of a primary, like a deterministic clear primary system of reference, primary, like a theoretical frame through which the film is, the text, is advised to be decoded, but it also the meaning and significance of a specific frame of reference can also shift over time as a result of basically shifts in like social cultural discourses, which may be amended by nothing else than the simple the obvious progress and change in society, or regression, like let's say if there will be like a dictatorship, like if the way like Russia would like to introduce in Europe, some things would be banned. You wouldn't be allowed to think in certain way. You wouldn't have this much of freedom, whether it is like it serves like certain classes and groups of elite in some way. You still like are provided with certain freedoms and choices that you can make for yourself. Certain like shifts, like social, cultural, political, historic shifts, can exercise like different forms of agency and withdraw that freedom from you, force you into like completely different ideology. So the individuals who make up an audience are understood to be active. That's the active audience is basically like you just know this. You watch something, you make a connection, you understand a sign. That's an activity. Even if you seem passive, if you understand, if you culturally consume something, you mean like actively engage. I mean, that's the point. When you make a semiotic deconstruction, if you understand the sign in regard to any system of reference, that means that an activity took place. So, basically those audiences are critically engaged and creative members of society. Rather than passively consuming mass culture, these audience members appropriate, transform, and extend its value. So appropriate, transform, and extend its value. This can also be related to, textual poaching. You derive like completely new meaning from a text, and you are able to provide a degree of like empirical evidence. You are able to apply a certain frame to a given text in accordance with which you derive you negotiate a certain meaning from it. And that's like textual poaching. Okay, can be discussed. I also like say these things because they may potentially in some of those things that I say, they may actually help you also with your report for your fun work, which you need to submit in months' time. Anyway, so audiences and communities are defined through acts of engagement rather than through shared geographic connections, beliefs, or cultural background. Social and participatory media are more aligned with the idea of platforms or services than with publications in a traditional sense. They allow individual users to engage and respond to online content, to post their own content, and to engage with each other, consequently facilitating new forms of cultural engagement. Participatory media have three specific interrelated characteristics: a technical structural characteristic, many model of production and consumption, a psychological and social characteristic. They derive their value from the active engagement of large number of people. A political and economic characteristic. They amplify existing and generate new social networks, enabling a more efficient coordination of activities. Social media have changed the understanding of an audience from a group of people who watched a particular example of culture, such as television show, no matter whatever, where the interactions of the group around this example remained unobservable to the public. Currently, audience activities and responses to forms of culture are content unobservable, and some of these activities unobservable. I lost the word here. The idea is that they are online, therefore you can actually, observe them. Yeah? Because the problem with all these reception studies is that you don't really know what people think. Yeah, you can't. You can ask them questions and you can theorize sets of data in regard to the patterns, but you don't really have the access to this the primary activity of of audiences. You don't know exactly the route through which the connections are made between a sign, a cultural artifact, and basically cultural capital and habitus. Yeah. However, this participatory media, social media, and all the technological apparatus made it more possible to trace some, of the interactions that still you don't really have the access to that primary activity, but many more mechanisms of negotiating meaning or value, or basically social interaction are observable now due to online apparatus. Yeah. And these interactions even attract their own audiences. Yeah, as for example, the real researchers, or even just different members of the audience. For example, just read the comments to see what happens there. Yeah, to basically see the debate. Yeah, how the discourse forms. Yeah. Let's say there is people are arguing about the quality of a show, yeah, and there are some people who only look for this. They don't say anything. They just read the comments, yeah, under a trial or something. Yeah. It could be researchers. It could be not necessarily professional, activity, yeah, but it's definitely a form of a content as well. So personal, commercial, and professional representations reside together online, posted to be appropriated and recontextualized. Participatory media blurs the previously established division between the public and the private realms of social and visual engagement. The convergence of the media landscape that is both a top-down corporate-driven process and a bottom-up consumer-driven process, where commercial or professional representations easily become incorporated into personal spheres. Conversely, personal content becomes a part of institutional collections. Social media reframes our understanding and experience of heritage by opening up more participatory ways of interacting with heritage objects and concepts in a complex set of sociological practices that interweave the memories, material traces, and performative enactments to give meaning and significance in the present to the lived realities of our past. New technologies augment the significance of place by bringing to the fore its character as the very matrix of our, out of which human significance and meaning arise. Participatory and social media enable forms of engagement with heritage through technology and have the potential to transform and augment this. They do not directly create them. So the meaning of an image occurs in three different sides, as images can be analyzed in terms of the production, the content of the image itself, the way they are viewed, the audience. Yeah, so that's so there are basically different approaches to analysis of negotiation of meaning. Can't really say much more because we're almost out of time. So analysis of, but I did focus on something similar to that in my MA, and I am focusing quite a bit on that during my PhD in like a Mitterian approach to genres. Analysis of everyday artifacts, photograph, diary, blog, forms of simulacra, posits a conceptual tool developed to articulate the way such objects serve to mediate the memories and identities of individuals and groups when they situate a person in his or her contemporary culture. Such artifacts are considered to be enabling technologies instead of categorized by their objecthood or format. Mediated memories align with the perspective of cognitive philosophy, where memory is, so I mentioned cognitive media theory last time when I discussed how it is possible that, you know, a genre film that is seemingly just for culture can be also treated as a political film, and then, you know, I argued that the Matrix is actually an allegory of socially constructed realities through which simulacra and simulation is expressed. And then I also, in the presentation that is available on Brightspace, I also argue that District 9 is actually a film about the nature of the habitus, and this is possible. I frame it with the cognitive media theory. So basically, mediated memories, which are, you know, one of the subjects of the reading, align with the perspective of cognitive philosophy, where memory is conceived as a relational process mediated by the brain's interaction with external objects. So participatory culture, both practices and technologies framed through the concept of mediated memories, can be understood to embody, facilitate, and support remembering identity and experience. Participatory culture offers a way of defining communities and audiences that exist globally through their participation and online public engagement. In the context of heritage, the term community is usually reserved to describe groups of people who are stakeholders in a particular site. In contrast, the term audiences usually describes those groups of people, such as tourists, who come to visit places of heritage. They usually are outsiders without a prior connection with the site of heritage, therefore they need education that will instill the values of visited places. So basically, you need a system of reference to recognize the meaning. Yeah. And some members of the audience have that system because they are like firmly nested in a certain, like basically like let's say habitus, and others just like copying, and therefore they need to engage, like know that they need to be educated about it. They need to be provided with a system of reference to like derive, to understand other approaches. Yeah. This is not like forcing the meaning, it's just like framing it with like opening ways to different interpretations. So if communities are understood to have a strong connection with place through geography or common interest, audiences are characterized as groups to whom a message was broadcast. Online participatory media platforms connect members of the same audience and make the structure of such groups more like communities. Therefore, the definitions no longer apply to the groups of people online. The overarching relationship between the categories of an ordering system that is key to the generation of knowledge. Any attempt at creating an ordering system relies on the result of a precise operation and the application of a preliminary criterion. So this is what I mentioned, the arbitrary taxonomies. Participatory culture offers a material and embodied conceptualization of the social-visual practices through which people make connection and express existing relationships with an artifact. The schema of social-visual schema is like a bit outdated now. I mean, depends on what disciplines, yeah, but people really move away from looking at things through schema. So I would go like basically trajectories of position, predisposed trajectories of position taking. I think that would be a better vocabulary, which could be argued means practically the same. Could be argued. of social-visual practices informs existing understanding of the way in which the production of representations of an artifact like sharing online are implicated in mediating relationships, temporality, and experience for individuals and communities. That was the last one. So, I don't know. I hope that I hope you got it. There was a lot in that reading, I admit that, and I did try to explain, to like shed more light or something. But if you have any questions, then I can address them. Whether about the reading, about the content of this seminar, or the upcoming assignment. Because this is our last seminar. It is also possible that this is my last seminar at all, because I'm actually not sure if I will be continuing my PhD next year. But I will definitely be marking your farmworks and reports. So if you have some trouble, I believe there is my email available on Brightspace. So if you would need if you would have questions, you can email either me or Professor Hills. You have a month to complete your final assignment, and just follow the criteria, and just explain in the report, explain your fun work thoroughly, and try to apply some critical theories, and you'll be fine. So that's basically it for today. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.